Hi, welcome back to the 1619 Project podcast. My name is Antonio Ruiz, and my friend here is Thomas Fields. We are at the last chapter of the 1619 Project. This one is written by I guess you would call her, I mean, she's the it says she's the creator, and she's also obviously the editor, Nikole Hannah Jones. And the title of the chapter is called Justice. Thomas, I want to. She covers a lot of ground. In many cases, summarizing a lot of things that we've talked about over the last 17 chapters. And one of the things that jumped out at me is one of the paragraphs talks about the prosperity of this country is inextricably linked with the forced labor of the ancestors of more than 30 million Black Americans, just as it's linked to the stolen land of the country's indigenous people. Though our high school history books seldom make this plain, slavery in the 100-year period of racial apartheid and racial terrorism known as Jim Crow were above all else systems of economic exploitation. To borrow a phrase from Ta-Nehisi Coates, racism is a child of economic profiteering, not the father. And she uses this to really kind of get into the issue of reparations. And the process of creating the racial wealth chasm begins with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40 acres they were promised. So the restitution that has never been given, and it's 155 years overdue. Let's start with reparations. And I'll go into a little bit more about how she writes about it. But as you understand the issue of reparations, what is it?
I give you my personal take on it. When I first started hearing about reparations, I was not fully supportive. And I think one is I clearly didn't have enough knowledge on it. And I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable, and I just thought, well, there's so many technical issues with reparations. How to determine who deserves reparations? How do you parcel it out? I just clearly didn't have enough. And also, I listened to a lot of propaganda was spread about it, which said basically, you're doing well, your family's done okay, why do you need reparations? And, I sort of had this guilt thing, which is sad to say that I had this guilt over reparations. But as I learned more, and particularly reading this chapter, it made me realize that reparations are a necessity. And it's a necessity for any person who can go back at least a generation into slavery. Something that she wrote in this book, I thought you were going to quote this, and this says a lot to me about reparations. And she says, all of this reveals that Black Americans, along with indigenous people, the two groups forced to be a part of this nation, that were forced to be a part of this nation, remain the most neglected beneficiaries of the America that would not exist without us. This unacknowledged debt, all of which is still occurring, and it is continuing to occur until we as a society decide to tolerate it no longer.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's a paragraph, I'm not sure if it's before or after that. It says here, while Black Americans were being systematically, generationally deprived of the ability to build wealth, and while some of them were also being robbed of the little they had managed to gain, Reconstruction, white Americans were not only free to earn money and accumulate wealth with exclusive access to the best jobs, best schools, and best credit terms, but also getting substantial government help in doing so. And you've talked about that.
Oh, yeah.
Many times.
It's what an author called affirmative action for whites. And you can look at the GI Bill as a classic example of that. Those soldiers that came back, black as well as white, that came back from World War II, were not treated equally. Whites got to basically get their GI Bills, use those at any school they wanted to, use those to purchase a home in any neighborhood they wanted to, and get mortgages that were subsidized. The same was not true for black GIs that returned. They were not allowed to go to those universities that were publicly funded by the taxpayers' money, some of which they paid. They were not allowed to get subsidized mortgages in those communities, which were segregated legally by the federal government. So that was an affirmative action for white people. And when you talk about affirmative action for people of color, for black people, suddenly, oh my God, they're not deserving it.
Because, yeah, and this goes to the issue of not only trying to make a case for reparations, which I think, I'll just point to this one thing where reparations are not about punishing white Americans. White Americans are not the ones who would pay for them. It's because what you constantly hear from the anti-reparations folks is, well, my ancestors,
Yes.
did not engage in slavery. I just immigrated here 2 weeks ago. Although, I think some cases may be made about which one of your ancestors did engage in slavery. And what the pro-reparations people talk about is the societal obligation in a nation where our Constitution sanctions slavery, and Congress passed laws protecting it, and our federal government initiated, condoned, and practiced legal racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans until half a century ago. And so it's convincing people today in this climate of really this schism in our society that there is a debt owed. And more importantly, who's going to pay that debt and how is that debt going to be paid? And yet, while there's growing, I think, by younger generation about the need to look at reparations, I think that it gets clouded up. The issue gets clouded up once again, going back to what you talk about language, gets clouded up in all the talk about social justice, gets, CRT, critical race theory, this idea that, and it also comes from Black Americans as well as other people of color. This idea that, that Black Americans are getting a free ride. I guess, what would you say to those folks, aside from the obvious things about a societal debt? What would you say to those people?
The answer to that is in this book,
right?
Page 469, and I just read it because it states it pretty bluntly. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate hotels and motels. It didn't cost a penny to guarantee the right to vote. Now we are in a period where it would cost the nation billions of dollars to get rid of poverty, and that's Black poverty as well as white poverty, to get rid of slums, to make quality integrated education a reality. And that, to me, talks about what the cost is. There's been no basic cost when you talk about what's owed to the former slaves. And the other part of this is this: when people talk about, well, there's never been a precedent set for this. That's untrue. And again, as it states a few pages later, each year Congress allocates money, and in 2020, it was $5 million to help support Holocaust victims living in America. Okay, that's Holocaust victims who were persecuted and killed in Germany, who live in this country, get $5 million from Congress each year. In backing the funding in 2018, a Democrat from Massachusetts said the country has a responsibility to support the surviving men and women of the Holocaust and their families. And he's right. It is a moral thing to do. This country has also paid reparations to Japanese American victims of internment during World War II and to some Native American nations. And yet, Congress has refused for 3 decades to pass H.R. 40, a bill introduced shortly after Congress approved reparations for Japanese Americans. I recall that very well.
Yeah.
Immediately after that, which simply states that there should be a study on the issue of reparations for descendants of American slavery. It didn't say anything about pass, it said study it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That bill has yet to get out of committee. Excuse me, I stand corrected. It got out of committee last year.
Right.
And it was introduced 30 years ago. And it just got out of committee, so it hasn't even been voted on by the full House. I would be happily surprised if it did pass just to study it. Okay. So that to me sums up a lot about where we are with reparations and the opposition to reparations.
It's and we can talk about the moral issues, being morally obligated to do this. I just think it goes back to also, let's be just very frank, the idea of many people let's just call it racism for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we're going to accept responsibility, because that's the other thing too. It's like, where does historical responsibility begin and where does it end? And it just kills me because this country loves to talk about our moral responsibility to the idea, the concept of a exceptional nation, the patriotism to our forefathers. Love to talk about those things, but unwilling to accept the flip side of that, the history of our forefathers being slave owners, the history of our forefathers and mothers being responsible for the exploitation of people. It's just like we only want to see one point of view of our history and not the other side. And to accept the other side is to then accept the responsibility for things like reparations. It's just not in our DNA. It's just not in our DNA. If you look at the history of this country, what it has taken for us to accept exploitation, the wrong that we've done against people. I mean, even to this day, even the exploitation of the past, the genocide against indigenous people.
Yeah.
I mean, people think this is cowboys and Indians, and the cowboys were the heroes and the Indians were the bad people. Still exists today. So the idea that we're going to accept some kind of moral responsibility, historical responsibility for, slavery. I mean, just look at what is happening in states like Florida, where they're actually creating curriculums that will make our George Washington and Thomas Jefferson look like they never owned slaves.
Yeah.
This is 2022, and we're still having these arguments. So to make the leap from that to the recognition of the need for reparations, I don't know what it's going to take. And I have, like you, hope in the younger generation, because I think they do understand it. I don't know. What's it going to take to make that happen?
Well, let's take this out of the moral side.
Yeah.
Okay. And because believe me, I'm all for morality, particularly in this instance. I'm not discounting that. But I want to argue this in pure cost and benefit analysis.
Yes.
I want to argue this as being something that is beneficial to the country. I want to argue this as something that's advantageous. I want to argue this as something that's really necessary in this decade, this century. We are in an economic fight with China, for example, okay? One of the things that China was very successful doing when they turned around the economy and made it into a quasi-capitalist society, they took a lot of people who had been poor and they guaranteed them a life and the promise of middle class, a promise of that they would have economic benefit. Now, let's set aside the fact that that promise was predicated on those people not arguing about human rights, their own human rights. But let's just talk about sheer economics. China was very successful doing it, unleashing the human potential of the resources of people in their economy, in their country. I would like to point to something, the Citibank, which is no raving liberal company, but they did a report in September 2020 called Closing the Racial Inequity Gap. And I would suggest everyone read that report. It's about 200 pages. It's very easy to read, a lot of graphs, very comprehensible graphs. And in a word, what this report stated was that, first of all, not addressing the racial gap cost the U.S. economy up to $16 trillion over the past 20 years. That's $16 trillion, okay? So it's in our benefit to enable people to realize their potential by investing in people, okay? And again, reparations, let's just set that aside. Let's talk about investments, which is what reparations would be. But I'm just saying, let's give it since words, I'm really big into words. That's what I do for a living. Let's talk about it as an investment. The other thing this report stated, if the racial gaps were closed today, let's say just today, we would see an additional $5 trillion of additional GDP in the next 5 years, or nearly 1% in global growth per year. Now, that would outstrip us with vis-a-vis China. Just think about it. If we put those people to work, we gave them education, we basically had our goal was to eliminate or close the gap, the racial economic gaps. Those are the benefits we see. It would make us as a country much more secure, keep our role as a leading factor in this world pretty secure, which I might add has literally always been what happens in this country. From starting with the Revolutionary War, when you had some of the first people to die in that war were blacks, starting with basically the economic development of this country, which is you had unpaid for labor, which propelled this country to becoming a superpower economic. That can repeat itself. Now, not the exploitation, but it can repeat itself and once again make this country a superpower.
Right.
And that's what I see reparations as opposed to a handout.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something. What's really, really interesting is when you talk about investment, and I get back to going back to some of my work in the 70s in Washington, D.C., even into the early 80s in D.C., where you had community development corporations, where you had the funding of local economic initiatives, whether they were entrepreneurial, whether they were nonprofit organizations whose job was about job training, whether it was even greater investment in the educational system to prepare this generation or that generation back then, and for the future economy. And as every year you have this discussion, but what people don't talk enough about is it enough? Is there enough investment? Is there enough monies that are being done? It's not just about having, more teachers and more resources. It's also about creating an ecosystem where you are literally investing from birth to graduation from college or technical school. And unless you have that follow-up, unless you have the infrastructure in the community to support all of that as well, you're just doing things, and that's part of the criticism, is that yes, we have a lot of stuff out there right now, but it's not, it's like a piece here, a piece there, and many times they're not working together, and they're not equitable across America. Some cities are better than others. Some smaller towns are better than others, but it's not there's no national strategy, consistent strategy, because as soon as one administration changes to another or the Congress changes, oh, well, we can't give any more money to that. We can give money to the military and we can cut the taxes on the 1%, but we're not going to invest in our communities. I don't understand it. Well, I understand it, but
I was going to say, of course you do.
Yeah, but this talk, I mean, even going back to I remember these reports back in the 60s talking about investments in communities. And there'd be some investment sometimes, but it's always limited, for the next couple of years. And you hit it on the head when you talk about, if you look at it strictly from how it benefits everybody, it sounds so logical. But unfortunately, I keep coming back. That little thing called racism just can't help inject itself into that.
Well, you talked about investments in communities. Just think about this. The amount of money we've spent militarizing our police departments, okay? And it is no accident that the militarization of police departments goes hand in hand with the war on drugs, and where those investments, again, we're talking about that. See, that funding's investments. Those are investments in the militarization of the police department, of putting boots on the ground in Black and brown neighborhoods to get drugs out. Okay, that is what we invested in, and don't forget, at the same time we did that, we started an unparalleled building spree, not of schools, but of prisons.
Prisons.
And again, I go back to my big plus. And where were those prisons built? In rural areas that were depressed economically, and they're white. And what was for them? What was the product going through them? Were Black and brown people. And who's benefited that? White people. Okay, and that is not being racist. That is telling you a reality, a fact of what this society has done.
I was just curious how much money we've spent on the war on drugs. And since 1971, this is according to an article in CNBC, America has spent over $1 trillion fighting the war on drugs. 50 years later, drug use in the U.S. is climbing again. This is a article dated 2021. Because the idea of the war on drugs is, if we just cut off the supply, if we just get rid of the cartels, if we just put as many drug dealers, and if we have to end up putting some drug users in jail, that is going to solve the problem.
Do you know what the war on drug is? Let's look at the reality. It's a job program.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, that's really it's a job program.
Yes.
And because if you think about this, okay, so we have said, okay, we're going to put in these forces, militarized forces, into these communities where, quote unquote, they're drugs. Now, we neglect the fact that drug usage in white neighborhoods is, in many cases, is as equal as it is in black neighborhoods, okay? But where we put our forces are in black neighborhoods, black and brown neighborhoods, let me be a little more precise. And the result is that you have destroyed the neighborhood. You're destroying that neighborhood. Yep. Economically, you're destroying it socially. And, you think about, okay, again, cost, benefits, analysis. Mm-hmm. So you've thrown that money in there, you destroy the neighborhood, right? Now, what you could say, in the long run, what you've done is you have sown the ground for gentrification. And who benefits from that? But the reality is, if a fraction of that money went into those communities in programs, again, a job program which benefited them, economic development, again, in those communities, versus the heavy boot of a militarized police force, the outcome would have been different. And people at the top know that. This is no mystery.
I want to wrap this up because I want to spend the last half hour talking about our general impressions of the book. And one of the things I just kind of continuously come back to is that, this idea that if we just put more police in communities, if we just were stricter, law and order, if we just sent more people to prison, if we just taught our young people to respect law enforcement, that would solve all the problems. Because if you listen to some right-wing radio and TV, that's what their mantra seems to be. And this idea that investing in people, investing in communities is somehow a waste of money versus the amount of money that's been wasted on things like building more prisons, building more, militarizing police. How do we get to a point like the Citibank report? How do we get to a point where we can convince the other side that this makes economic sense? Because the GOP, I thought, stood for about the economic power of this country. What do we do?
Well,
how do we convince?
Do
we need more Citibank reports from Goldman Sachs and
from? How many people read those? Okay, it's not widely disseminated. Let's start with that. And I think the second thing is that if you look at who benefits from this militarization of the police, there's a big part of your answer.
Yeah, right.
It's the people that benefit from it want to keep that intact. They do not want there to be a success in those communities. Do you think? I mean, let's just be honest about it. Do you think they want to see thriving Black and brown communities? They do not. Because if you did, they would jeopardize their jobs.
Go ahead.
Okay, and I'm just being perfectly blunt about it. That is the reality we face as long as we have a racist and a systematically racist society. It is seen in those stark terms. That's the reality, man.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I got to tell you something. I think only when I can't believe I'm actually saying this. Only when corporate America begins to understand the long-term benefit versus burden of economic improvement on a community level, where they are, because they're always complaining about everything from, I can't tell you how many times I've heard stories about them complaining about, our workforce isn't educated enough. We can't seem to retain people, training efforts, the need for people coming out of both technical schools as well as colleges. I mean, they have just as much at stake here as everybody else. So
yes, they do. But
maybe one day somebody will wake up and go, "Hey, this is going to be a good thing to do."
Antonio, let me throw this out to you. And I probably have these figures wrong because I'm not looking at them now. But in the state of California, which is perceived as being a quote unquote progressive liberal state, we spend about $5,000 per student in education.
Yeah.
Okay. How much do we spend per prisoner in this state? We spend about $8,000, okay, to incarcerate, lock up people. Now,
those numbers are bigger than that, but you're
they
right.
are. But I'm using that.
Yeah, right.
Okay, they are, and that's why I said don't know the numbers. But I'm using that as a correlation of where we put our priorities. Do we put our priorities on educating people, or do we put our priorities on locking them up, jailing them, building prisons, paying for police? I mean, that tells you what is behind all of this. And in this country, if you want to see the reality of anything, look where the money goes.
Yeah. So in the less than half hour that we have left, we've now covered quite a few subjects in the subjects of chapters of 1619 Project. And, this book has been out now, what, 2 years?
I think something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just sort of curious. First of all, what's your takeaways from the book?
Oh, God. I think this is...
Give me 3 of them.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important books that I've certainly read in the last 10 years, okay, and possibly longer than that. I think it's going to change things because one of the things that this book does, it documents what we might have known or didn't know, but it documents it with facts. It's a scholarly endeavor. It's not me writing something, putting down my ideas or my opinions. It's backed by reality, backed by fact. That's my first thing. Second thing is, it has started the conversation that we've needed to have in this country for quite a while. I've always wanted to have a truth and reconciliation board or council or body.
Commission, yeah.
Commission to basically bring this stuff out in the open. And one of the things you're seeing in reaction to not just this book, but to this whole discussion, this CRT. And because for the other side, they don't want the facts. They want to demonize this stuff. They want to have they want to have a version that is mythologized.
Yeah.
And so to me, what this book does is it puts it out there as a statement that, okay, you point out what's wrong with this book. You point out the errors in this book. Otherwise, this is the book that you read if you want to read about what's happened in this country since 1619.
Yeah. You got one more.
Oh, I got one more. Well, and I guess the last thing I'd say is that I'm very glad that you invited me along on this journey to read this book with you. I would have read this book, no doubt, by myself. But one of the things that's been really enlightening and engaging has been to read it with someone else and come and talk about it with that person and get their viewpoint. Whose viewpoints sometimes I agree, most of the time, vast majority of times I agree with, but occasionally I have variant, and sometimes that person disagrees with me. So it forces me to look back on what I'm saying. So I found this book to be a wonderful conversation starter, and I thank you again for putting in the time to bring this together.
Thank you. You and I are around the same age, but we both came up during the 60s. And I have been very lucky to have been on the ground floor of a lot of interesting things, both in New York, where I grew up. I lived in DC during the 70s and the early 80s. And I got a chance to see and work for and with people who are doing extraordinary things on both the community level as well as the state and federal government federal level in terms of dealing with both the civil rights movement, anti-poverty programs, social justice against police brutality, and a whole host of things, education reform. And this sort of deals a little bit with the question of how far we've come. We have come tremendously far from the days of the March on Washington, from the days of 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Act. I think, and I'm going to accept some responsibility for this myself, is that there was a point when I got very comfortable where I was. Hey, I got mine. You know, had a great job, had a house, you know, I was working in Hollywood. And it took me to come back to the community level. And whether it was on a board of a nonprofit, whether it was working with young people, to realize, oh my God, there's so much more work to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, and I'm not talking about the stuff that was happening in the news and, you know, very visible. I'm talking about when you sit down with a young person who tells you that, you know, they're having a hard time doing their homework and asking, hey, do you mind if I come to, because we had a program mentoring young people in journalism and media. Do you mind if I do my homework over here? Because it's quieter here. Because all we've got is a table in the kitchen and 5 other people are doing their homework. And, you know, and I have to share my computer, not my computer, the computer with my brothers and sisters. Can I use one of the Macs here? And that's when you start to realize,
Yeah,
we're talking 2012, 14, 15, not 1950, 1960. And you go, oh my God.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say it was just one young person who told me this. And you start to realize, just even here in Long Beach, you begin to realize how much work there's still to be done. Yes, there's been progress. But boy, we got a lot of work still to do. And this book, for me, helps to contextualize all of that.
Good word.
Both in terms of the history and the, as she talks about in the preface, the origins. When you look and study, because I love American history. When you look at American history and you realize we've done so much to, we've done so much to hide behind the myth of the exceptional country. That we just love to put our heads, just like I did for a decade, put my head in the sand and acted like, oh, we've progressed. We don't need any of this stuff anymore. And this book has helped me to like get my head out of the sand, or out of my, anyway, and realize you know what? I have an obligation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how I do that is doing things like this with you, but also writing, supporting efforts wherever I can, because there are a lot of people out there who are, and I tried to do this a little bit when was publishing Palacio magazine. For those 5 years, I tried to publicize people who were doing things, community organizations, individuals. And I think that we need to continue to do that. But we have to also encourage the next generation behind us and the two generations coming up behind us. I think in our case, 3 generations coming up behind us, that the future is theirs. And it's on them. I mean, I know we still have an obligation. I'm not trying to get out of that obligation, but that we really do need to encourage and support those generations that are coming up behind us.
Yeah. That generation gives me a great deal of hope, the generations behind us. We touched on it, George Floyd, what that meant. And as it was pointed out again, that was in the middle of a pandemic. People around the world came out. I think there is an awareness that we are in this together. I mean, you no longer can simply pull the old switcheroo. You can no longer pull the old divide and conquer. Yes, there's always going to be those counter forces. There's no question about that. But they don't have the moral authority behind them. They don't have the high road. Their position is getting weakened and eroding. And this book helped me see that. My story, certainly in terms of my being in corporate America, is similar to yours. And that I was one of the lucky ones. For a while, I wouldn't say ashamed, but a little leery of being called the affirmative action baby, because of the negativity that was put on that.
Yeah.
But I also knew that there was something called legacy, and I know very well about white legacy, particularly in the Ivy League colleges, particularly in Walls and Madison Avenue. So I quickly got over my being an affirmative action baby thing when I looked at that. But at the same time, as you stated, I felt I had made it, was making it, and I got sometimes you get so swept up in that. So but one of the things I will say in my case, because I saw the higher I climbed, the more opposition I got.
Yeah.
And it was like, it's really kind of the hypocrisy is amazing, because of course there's this thing about, if black people, only more black people did what you did, only more black people were like you, we could solve this, right? And then on the other hand is, oh shit, you're doing that, you can't let you do that, you're a threat. And that's what I think a lot of people in the position you're talking about encounter. But at the same time, I really am gratified there are people like Hannah Jones that is in the New York Times that got them to put their assets behind this and the resources that need to get this out to the world. Because this book is really, I believe this book's going to change the conversation in a very positive way.
And there's a number of books and one of the things I'll do on the website at the end of the series, actually at the end of every chapter, every podcast that we do, I'm going to start putting in other reading resources that people should check in, as well as there's videos out there that are doing great things as well, and other podcasts Thank you very much, Thomas Fields.
Thank you so much.
Antonio Ruiz. This is the 1619 Project Podcast. The book is A New Origin Story, created by Nikole Hannah Jones, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the New York Times Magazine, the 1619 Project. Thank you.
See you on down the road.